And so I have, I just think what I would like to say, it's true, is that for a man as well as for a woman, physical beauty, when you have the rest, is indeed a big advantage in life. You have to acknowledge it.
Alain Delon was one of the most beautiful human beings the cinema ever produced, and he knew it. That is not a criticism, it is a fact, and Delon himself would have been the first to confirm it without embarrassment. He had a face that photographers described as almost technically perfect, a physical presence that filled a frame with a combination of danger and elegance that no amount of coaching could teach or replicate, and a screen charisma that made him, during the peak years of his career in the 1960s and 1970s, one of the most recognizable and desired actors in the world. Le Samouraï, The Leopard, Purple Noon, Rocco and His Brothers. Films that were not simply successful but genuinely important. Works that are still studied and admired decades after they were made, each one bearing the unmistakable stamp of a performer who understood his own power and used it with a precision that was almost frightening to watch. But Delon was not only beautiful, and he was not only talented, and anyone who reduces him to either of those qualities misses the full complexity of the man. He was proud in a way that crossed regularly into arrogance. He was direct in ways that the French film industry, which has a high tolerance for strong personalities, sometimes found remarkable even by its own standards. He held grudges with a consistency and a patience that people who experienced them found impressive in a rather uncomfortable way. He had opinions about everything and shared them without particular concern for whether those opinions were welcomed or whether the people they concerned would ever forgive him for stating them. He was also someone whose private feelings about his colleagues, rivals, and occasional enemies were considerably more intense than his public statements usually suggested, and those private feelings had a way of shaping the professional landscape around him in ways that the people involved understood clearly, even when they were not publicly acknowledged. What follows is an honest account of 6 people toward whom Delon's private feelings were, by documented accounts and consistent reports from people who knew him, something that went well beyond professional indifference. Each situation is told with the context it requires to be properly understood. Luchino Visconti is the first name on this list, and including him requires immediate and careful qualification, because the relationship between Delon and Visconti was also one of the great creative partnerships in the history of European cinema. Visconti directed Delon in Rocco and His Brothers in 1960 and in The Leopard in 1963, and both films stand as genuine masterpieces, works of extraordinary ambition and visual beauty that gave Delon the kind of artistic credibility that his extraordinary ambition and visual beauty that his extraordinary looks might otherwise have threatened to overshadow. Visconti saw in Delon something that not every director had the vision or the patience to develop, and Delon gave Visconti performances that belonged in the same company as anything the Italian neo-Orialist tradition had produced. But Visconti was also a deeply controlling director who had strong personal feelings about Delon that went beyond the professional, and the relationship between them was marked by a possessiveness on Visconti's part that Delon found over time genuinely suffocating. Visconti was openly gay at a time when that carried significant social weight even in the relatively permissive world of European art cinema, and his attachment to Deon, who was young, extraordinarily beautiful, and new to the world that Visconti inhabited, had a personal dimension that the two men navigated in ways that were not always comfortable for either of them. Delon has spoken about Visconti across various interviews over the decades with a mixture of genuine reverence for the director's talent and a more guarded quality when the personal dimension of the relationship comes up. People who knew both men during their working years have described a friction that developed over time as Delon's own star power grew large enough that Visconti's authority over him, creative, social, personal, could no longer be maintained at the level Visconti preferred. The older man found the gradual assertion of Delon's independence difficult to accept graciously, and Delon, who had his own considerable pride and his own very clear sense of his worth and his autonomy, found the ongoing possessiveness increasingly difficult to accommodate. The result was a creative relationship that produced 2 genuine masterpieces and then fractured under the weight of its own complications, a loss for cinema that both men felt, in their different ways, and that neither appears to have ever fully reconciled with, even across the decades that followed. Jean-Paul Belmondo occupied a specific and particularly charged place in Delon's professional and personal landscape for most of their parallel careers, and the relationship between them is one of the more richly documented examples of competitive tension in the history of French cinema. The two men were almost exactly the same age, emerged into prominence at almost exactly the same time, and were for decades the dominant twin poles of French male stardom. Delon the dark, controlled, aristocratically beautiful one. Belmondo, the loose, charming, physically exuberant counterpoint. French audiences loved both of them. Critics debated their respective merits endlessly. The industry found room for both of them and no way to fully choose between them. That parallel existence was not comfortable for Delon. He was not someone who found competition clarifying or energizing in the way that some performers do. He found it wearing, and he found the specific terms of his competition with Belmondo, in which the qualities that defined each of them were consistently positioned as alternatives to rather than complements of the other, deeply frustrating. The comparison implied that what Belmondo had was something Delon lacked, and what Delon had was something Belmondo lacked, and neither man's definition of himself had room for that kind of implied limitation. Delon's private comments about Belmondo, as reported by people who knew him across different periods of his career, were not uniformly charitable. He respected Belmondo's talent in the way that competitive people respect the genuine abilities of those they are competing with, which is to say, with an acknowledgement they coexisted with a strong and consistent desire to be definitively regarded as the better of the two. The public relationship between them went through periods of apparent warmth and periods of visible tension, and the underlying competitive current never fully resolved into either genuine friendship or open hostility. It remained for most of their parallel careers something in between, a mutual awareness that was too charged to be simple and too professional to become entirely personal. Romy Schneider is among the most painful entries on this list, because the relationship between her and Delon was one of the great love stories and one of the great wounds of his life, and the feelings that developed between them over the years that followed their romantic relationship cannot be reduced to simple categories like dislike or animosity. They met in 1958 when both were young and at the beginning of what would become major careers. They were engaged. They were, by accounts from people who knew them during those years, genuinely in love in the total, consuming way that young people who are both extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily talented sometimes fall in love, with an intensity that neither of them appears to have fully recovered from, even after the relationship ended. Delon broke off the engagement in 1963, and the circumstances of that ending, and of the years that followed, created a complicated knot of feeling between them that never fully untangled. They continued to work together after the breakup, most notably in La Piscine in 1969, a film whose charged erotic tension was evidently not entirely manufactured for the camera, and the professional relationship continued to intersect with the personal one in ways that both of them found difficult to manage cleanly. Schneider struggled significantly across her later years, dealing with personal tragedies including the death of her son, and Delon's conduct toward her during some of those difficult periods was characterized by people close to both of them as something less than the generosity and loyalty that she might have hoped for from someone who had once been so central to her life. Delon has spoken about Schneider in interviews with a retrospective tenderness that has grown more pronounced as the years have passed, and as the loss of her, she died in 1982 at the age of 43, has had time to settle into something that can be discussed with the softening that distance sometimes provides. But people who were close to the situation during the years when the relationship was still active and still complicated have described feelings on Delon's part that were more mixed and more difficult than the retrospective tenderness suggests. A combination of residual attachment, guilt about the ending and its aftermath, and a frustration with the ongoing emotional weight of the connection that he could not simply set aside. Henri Verneuil directed Delon in several films during the 1960s and 1970s, and was among the more commercially successful French directors of his era, a filmmaker with a genuine talent for the kind of tightly constructed thriller and crime film that French audiences consumed enthusiastically during those decades. The professional relationship between Verneuil and Delon produced films that were financially significant and that served Delon's star persona well, which is the kind of creative relationship that should produce at minimum a functional professional warmth. But Delon's private feelings about Verneuil were more complicated than the commercial success of their collaboration suggested. Delon had strong and clearly defined ideas about the kind of director he wanted to work with, the kind whose vision went beyond the efficient execution of a commercially viable script, whose engagement with the material was artistic rather than purely professional, whose presence behind the camera created conditions for performance rather than simply capturing it. Verneuil was a skilled craftsman who served the story, and for Delon, who had worked with Visconti and Antonioni and had a genuine feeling for what directorial ambition looked like when it was truly operating at a high level, skilled craftsmanship was not always enough. People who knew Delon during his working years with Verneuil have described a condescension in his private references to the director that sat awkwardly alongside the professional cooperation that their shared productions required. Delon's artistic standards were high and his willingness to disguise his assessment of people who did not meet them was limited, and Verneuil's position in his personal hierarchy of directors was not, by most accounts, a flattering one. The films got made, the films made money, and the collaboration continued for practical reasons that both men understood clearly. But Delon's genuine regard for Verneuil as a creative figure appears to have been considerably more modest than the public record of their work together might suggest. Jean Gabin is perhaps the most historically interesting entry on this list because the tension between him and Delon was rooted not in personal conduct or creative disagreement, but in the specific dynamics of generational succession in French cinema. The complicated feelings that develop when the person who was once the dominant figure in a cultural landscape begins to recognize that someone younger has arrived to displace him, and when the younger person both reveres and chafes against the authority of the figure he is replacing. Gabin was the defining male star of French cinema for roughly 3 decades before Delon's emergence, the embodiment of a specific working-class French masculinity, weathered and authentic and enormously compelling on screen in ways that had made him a genuine cultural institution by the time Delon came along. He had survived the war, survived the complicated personal and professional aftermath of that period, and rebuilt his career in the 1950s with a series of films that demonstrated a resilience and a depth that added dimension to what had already been an extraordinary career. Delon admired Gabin with a sincerity that was visible to people who knew him during his early years in the industry. But the admiration was complicated by the competitive dynamic that Delon's very existence imposed on the relationship. The inevitable fact that the emergence of a new dominant male presence in French cinema was also implicitly a statement about the waning of the previous one. Gabin was aware of this, and his feelings about Delon, as described by people who knew both men during the years when their careers overlapped, contained a mixture of genuine recognition of Delon's talent and a territorial resentment that Gabin was not always careful to fully conceal. Delon's response to that resentment was characteristic. He did not soften his manner to make Gabin more comfortable with the succession that was happening, regardless of anyone's feelings about it. He was not deferential in the way that a younger person navigating a complicated relationship with an established figure might choose to be for strategic reasons. He was himself, proud, direct, and entirely clear about his own assessment of his place in French cinema in ways that Gabin found difficult to receive graciously and that left marks on the relationship between them that never fully faded. The final relationship on this list involves a category of figure rather than a single named individual, because the pattern it describes is more revealing than any single example. Delon had a deep and consistently documented dislike of what he described privately as actors who confused publicity with performance, people whose presence in the cultural conversation was built on the management of their image rather than on the quality of their work, who were famous in ways that had become disconnected from any genuine artistic foundation. This category of person in Delon's private taxonomy represented something close to a fraud, a corruption of the idea that cinema was worth caring about, that the screen presence of an actor was supposed to mean something beyond the marketing apparatus surrounding it. The specific figures who drew his most pointed private comments in his category were, by accounts from people close to him, primarily drawn from the new generation of French and European performers who emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, and whose careers were built on a media culture that Delon found fundamentally alien to everything he had understood the film industry to be about. He had come up in a world where the great directors, Visconti, Antonioni, Clement, Melville, were the gravitational centers around which everything else organized itself, and where the actor's job was to serve their vision with every tool at his disposal. The world he watched emerging around him in his later career was organized around different principles entirely, and his contempt for those principles was real and consistent and not particularly private. People who worked with Delon during the later decades of his career have described a man who was increasingly impatient with what he saw as the trivialization of the craft he had given his life to, and whose specific comments about younger performers he believed were benefiting from that trivialization were pointed enough that the people who heard them understood them as genuine expressions of how he felt, rather than rhetorical performances. He was not angry in the way that people who have failed become angry. He was angry in the way that people who have genuinely loved something become angry when they watch it change in directions they cannot accept. Alain Delon was not an easy man, and nobody who knew him well ever claimed he was. He was difficult in ways that were inseparable from what made him extraordinary. The pride, the high standards, the refusal to pretend that things were acceptable when he found them unacceptable, the directness that the people around him experienced as either bracing or simply aggressive depending on which end of it they happened to be on. His dislikes were real and his reasons for them were usually coherent, even when the expression of those feelings created professional and personal complications that a more diplomatic person would have avoided. What the 6 relationships on this list reveal, taken together, is a consistent portrait of a man whose primary loyalty was to a specific idea of what cinema was supposed to be: serious, demanding, artistically ambitious, built on the foundations of genuine craft and genuine vision rather than on the management of celebrity. When people around him honored that idea, even imperfectly, he could extend a generosity and a genuine creative engagement that made him one of the most rewarding actors in the world to work with. When people violated it, through commercial calculation, through image management, through the substitution of personality for performance, his response was not tolerance. It was a dislike that was private when it needed to be, and visible when it could not be helped. That is not the description of a saint. It is the description of someone who cared deeply about something and who found the various ways the world failed to share that caring genuinely difficult to accept. In an industry that produces a great many people who learn to care about very little beyond their own continued success, that quality, difficult and sometimes cruel in its expression as it could be, is worth understanding for what it actually was.